Hi and welcome to Sword vs. Dragon, where I show you why Dungeons & Dragons is a badly designed game and how I fix those problems in my own system, Ishanekon World Shapers. Today's topics are weapons, and why the weapon choices in Dungeons & Dragons are boring and there's barely any difference between them. First, you might say that there are plenty of weapons with many properties which you can choose in Dungeons & Dragons, but there are three problems with that thought. First of all, half of those weapons aren't really relevant. Dungeons & Dragons puts weapons in the simple and martial category. And simple weapons are basically just worse versions of martial weapons. Usually classes that fight with weapons gain proficiency with martial weapons, so they don't need the simple weapons. And classes who do not get proficiencies with any martial weapons usually don't need weapons in the first place. So most simple weapons are mostly there for flavor, maybe to give NPCs weaker weapons, but as a player you almost never have a reason to use a simple weapon. You start to see how this is a problem when you want, for example, to play the classic dagger-wielding rogue, a very widespread character archetype. But the problem with that is, rogues have proficiency with sword shorts and rapiers. Both of them are strictly better. In Ishanekon World Shapers, I made sure that every single weapon is viable. They may have different strengths and weaknesses, but you can use whatever you want. If we go back to the dagger-wielding rogue, in Ishanekon World Shapers, a dagger is just as effective as a weapon as a sword or a rapier, and therefore a valid combat choice. Problem number 2. Many weapons are basically just the same weapon. If we look at the classic martial one-handed weapons, we've got the battle axe, the flay, the warhammer, the warpig, and of course the classic longsword. And they all deal 1d8 damage. You could argue they deal different damage types, but Dungeons & Dragons is not Dark Souls or Elden Ring, where the damage types matter with almost every enemy. No, in 99% of cases, the damage type doesn't make a difference. So they're pretty much all the same. When we go to two-handed weapons, it's even worse. You got the maul and the greatsword, but then you have the great axe, which is just statistically worse in every way. One might argue, but it interacts better with the crit features of the half-orc and the barbarian. But if you do the math, you'll find out that on average it's less damage. Even in such edge cases, you're better off with a greatsword or a maul. Again, same problem with the dagger. It's just weaker. And if you know about that, it feels bad taking the weaker weapon, even though great axes are supposed to be epic cool weapons. Also, if you look at the difference between two-handed weapons and one-handed weapons, usually the difference is just that they deal more damage. They don't actually feel that different in combat. Yes, there are features, like the fighters' fighting styles, but as I already discussed in the first video, they don't really make that much of a difference, with the exception of dual-wielding one-handed weapons. I'll give you that one. What did I do in Ishanekon World Shapers? First of all, every weapon requires two stats to wield effectively, a primary stat and a secondary stat, which was inspired by Dark Souls, by the way. The required stats gives every single weapon a unique feel, because it reflects the character. Almost all weapons still require dexterity or strength to wield, making them the most important weapon stats. But what additional stat it is wielded with usually informs you about the weapon. Intelligence-based weapons either require you to know the weak spots of the enemies to take advantage of them, like with a dagger or a sniper, or they're tech weapons or magical weapons that require intellect and understanding to get all out of them. A charisma weapon are weapons that are graceful in one way or another. Using them is more like a dance, like a rapier or a whip, while instinct weapons either require keen senses to use, like a hunting rifle or a crossbow, or require aggressive, quick attacks, like fist weapons or claws. Constitution weapons are heavy and require a lot of endurance to wield, like blunt weapons or the minigun or the mini ballista. Another thing I added to give each of the 87 weapons more of a unique identity is that every single weapon has a greater talent related to it. For example, Swordmaster, that emphasizes the mobility of the sword by allowing you to make an attack if you miss with a sword. Or Bullet Spray, which allows you to make an area of effect attack with miniguns and assault rifles, just spraying your attack all over the battlefield. Finally, point 3. you would say there are differences in the weapons. They have different traits and properties, right? But most of those properties aren't really that important. The heavy property, for example, just means if you're a small creature, you cannot use it. So for most creatures that wield heavy weapons, it doesn't make any difference. Throwing weapons, for example, seem cool at first, but the problem is that Dungeons & Dragons doesn't allow you to pull out an infinite amount of weapons. So usually, once you reach level 5 and get your extra weapon attack, throwing weapons become useless because you can only make one attack with them before you run out. The versatile property allows you to wield a one-handed weapon with two hands, but usually you either have a shield, so you can't do that, or you use bonuses like dueling, which makes it stronger wielding it with one hand. So it's not really relevant, which pretty much leaves you with finesse, that allows you to wield a weapon with dexterity, the light property, which allows you to dual wield it, and the reach property, which increases the range of the melee weapon. The other properties deal with ranged weapons and more or less just say this is a ranged weapon, ammunition and so on. The only really relevant one is the loading properties for crossbows. If we look at the weapons of Ishanekon World Shapers, first of all there are 6 weapon categories. Simple, medieval, military, tech, unearthly and mind. If we look at the weapon properties of Ishanekon World Shapers, you will see that more of them are actually relevant. You have elemental, mystic and psychic, which can change the damage type of the weapon into something more relevant than just different flavors of physical damage that are not really relevant. You have adaptable, which allows a weapon to also deal physical damage if their normal damage type is not physical. Flexible is for ranged weapons, which allows you to also use them effectively in close combat, making them hybrid weapons, like shotguns for example, or throwing weapons. Then the heavy property actually has an influence in my system. It doubles the price of the weapon and doubles the weight. In Ishanekon World Shapers, inventory weight is far more limited and important, so doubling the weight of a weapon is a significant cost. And then there are loud weapons, which are bad for sneaking, like modern firearms, right? So you gotta be careful with those. And there's the reload property, which forces you to use 3 action points to attack instead of 2 when using that weapon, making them slower and clunkier if you don't compensate for that in some way. I hope you start to see how Ishanekon World Shapers makes the weapon choice far more relevant, enforcing the identity of your character and changing your combat style to a significantly stronger degree than your choices in Dungeons & Dragons. You can find the entire rule set for free on my website, link in the description below. Thank you everybody for watching and see you next time, where we talk about how Dungeons & Dragons is built for combat and nothing else, and how my system allows you to build characters which are not made for combat. See you next time, bye!